Hello, everyone. Welcome to RJ Julia. My name is Jackie. I'm your Met name, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest of honor, Kemper Donovan. So just a little bit about him before we get started. Kemper is an acclaimed author and host of the podcast All About Agatha, joining us here tonight to celebrate his newest novel, The Busybody, which has been described as a gripping and highly entertaining mystery. A wonderful detective character that readers will be dying to meet again. Definitely want to get your hands on this one if you haven't already. We will have time for a Q&A after the presentation, as well as the signing line. So if you haven't got it, I know I see a few books out there, but we have them available at the register, so you can pick one up afterwards, and then Kemper can sign it for you. But I hope you enjoy. Turn it over to you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm so thrilled to be here. And I'm from Los Angeles, and I'm on a little bit of a tour here now on the East Coast, and it's been really great despite the weather, which has cleared up beautifully. So I love that the sun came out for this event, and I appreciate you all making the trip to come out and be here today. And I also just want to thank RJ Julia Booksellers, and it's so important to support independent bookstores, which I know you all know because you're here. So thank you so much for having me. Another reason I'm really thrilled to be here is that it's unusual for me to get to lecture to people in the flesh, in real life, about the wonders of the mystery genre, and in particular, the greatness of Agatha Christie. I, for the last 7.5 years, have hosted a podcast called All About Agatha that is dedicated to the one and only Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. For the first 5 years of the podcast, I co-hosted it with my good friend, Catherine Brobeck. It started very much as a joint venture. Catherine passed away at the end of 2021. And I have continued the podcast without her, but I actually dedicated this book to Catherine because it was really while we were reading and reviewing and ranking every single novel that Agatha Christie wrote, and she wrote a lot of novels, that I realized it was crazy I hadn't written a mystery novel of my own. I had published one other novel before the podcast, and it wasn't a mystery, and I was really struggling with what to write next. And I realized, well, if I'm spending this much time on Agatha Christie, not just reading, but analyzing what she wrote and preparing these podcast episodes, recording them, editing them, distributing them, and I still can't get enough of her, and then just generally of mystery, maybe I should write a mystery. And Catherine was really part of that realization, and The Busybody is a direct result of that realization that I had. This became my next book, and I would never have gotten there without the podcast and Catherine. So just to give you a sense of how much of an Agatha Christie nerd I am, in addition to doing this podcast, every September I make a pilgrimage to England, to Agatha Christie's birthplace in Torquay, on the south coast. It's on the lovely English Riviera down there. And I participate in the Agatha Christie Festival, both as a speaker and an attendee. I've also spoken twice at the Agatha Christie Conference, which is a more academically oriented lecture series that's focused on all things mystery and Christie related. And the reason that the Agatha Christie Festival is in September is that Agatha Christie's birthday is September 15th. My husband's birthday is also September 15th. So what that means is that on his birthday for years in a row now, I have fled the country and left him to fend for himself with our 2 young children. We have a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old currently. So that just thrills him, as you can imagine. And I like to say that I've been given a choice between, my life partner and Agatha Christie, and I've chosen Dame Agatha, and I continue to do so. So I'm very much a nerd when it comes to Agatha Christie. And one of the reasons that I'm so vocal about my admiration for her and for her writing is that I think there's a lingering sense among literary types that she's not actually a good writer. People credit her for being clever and coming up with plots or puzzles or tricks that are pleasing. But there's this sense that when it comes to character and style and other writerly elements, her writing is schoolgirlish, which is how one of her critics put it during her own lifetime. And I think one of the reasons for that is that many people begin to read Christie when they're quite young, or even when they're learning English for the first time, if English isn't their first language. And they do that because her prose is clear and straightforward, and her pacing is impeccable. It's almost impossible to put down a Christie once you've begun one. So for that reason, her work is used as a stepping stone, a little bit of a means to an end. I like to think of it as almost a gateway drug to becoming an avid and passionate reader. And that's very much how it worked for me. I started reading Christie around when I was 8 or 9 years old. But because of that, I think she's easily dismissed. And unfairly dismissed. I think there's nothing more easy to underestimate than good, clean prose. It's actually really hard to write that clearly and that simply and evocatively as she does. And I speak from experience when I say that. I think that Christie should always be given the credit that these days I think she's starting to be given, even in more academic circles. That's has evolved somewhat. I also think that there's a fair amount of misogyny in the way people dismiss Christie, who was a woman writing in a genre that has always been enjoyed by many other women. You can even see that in the characterization of her writing as schoolgirlish, not just childish, but schoolgirlish. Even today, she does get dismissed as cozy sometimes. She's really not cozy. Other mystery writers such as Kane and Chandler and Hammett, they too write squarely in the mystery genre, and they're lauded as great writers. The difference is that they write noir, and noir is very much male-driven. And I really think that's the only difference. So this sort of double standard drives me nuts. And I do what I can to rectify this injustice, both as a podcaster and now as an author. So I have a little question for you, a little pop quiz. Can anyone tell me how many full-length mystery novels Agatha Christie wrote?
Is it not 66?
It is 66. You are correct. Very good. I usually get like somewhere around 60 maybe or something, but you were dead on. It is 66. Starting in 1920 when she was 30 years old, and ending in 1976 when she died at the age of 85. That is a lot of novels. Not every single one of them is a masterpiece, but I think a good 2/3 of them are. And I can say that with some confidence because my podcast partner, Catherine, and I read these books closely. We pored over them. We analyzed them. We broke them down into different categories, and we assigned these categories scores. And it's really not until you get to the bottom third of that roster that you start coming across titles that have serious flaws in them. There are certainly writers who have written as much as Christie and even more than Christie. I always like to point to the adventure writer Edgar Wallace. He wrote the script that would become King Kong. That was kind of his genre. He wrote 170 novels in his lifetime and almost 1,000 short stories, which is a crazy amount of writing. And guess what? A lot of them are really bad. They were just very quickly written and not edited. I think Christie is the rare writer who combined quantity with quality. And she really did write a remarkable number of high-functioning and even brilliant mysteries. She's also unusual as an author in that many people know her not through her books, but through the many adaptations of her work that have been made over the years. And there's nothing wrong with this. I think one of the joys of being a Christie fan is getting to watch Billy Wilder's Witness for the Prosecution from 1957, which was one of my very favorite movies, not just mystery movies. Or television shows such as David Suchet's Poirot series, which ran from 1989 to 2013. It's a big favorite of mine, and probably I see a lot of people nodding there. As wonderful as these films and TV shows are, they do warp or water down or otherwise alter what Christie does on the page. They have to. It's a change in medium. And she really was a virtuoso of the written medium. I think one of the most egregious misconceptions here is as to setting, because if you only watch these adaptations of Christie, you might think that she set her stories in a sort of fantasy land, a timeless, idealized mid-century Britain, in which people linger in their beautiful gardens on their country estates until a maid drops a tray somewhere and screams over the discovery of a dead body. We've all seen those scenes play out in various adaptations. And similar-ish scenes do play out in Christie's text, but they are usually more grounded than that, and crucially, much more specific as to time. It's actually very easy to tell when each of her books was written. And since she started writing during the First World War and didn't stop until the early 1970s, reading through her canon is like getting a guided tour of the 20th century. It's one of my favorite things about Christie, and there are very few writers you could say about whom you could say the same. In fact, and this is one of my favorite fun facts to trot out, Christie often made use of real life scenarios that were being reported on or spoken about while she was writing. She would incorporate them into her storylines either by direct reference or just by weaving them into her fictional plots. And often these real life scenarios took the form of what we would call true crime, which is all the rage these days, but it was all the rage back then as well. It's always been all the rage. And some of these references go over our head now, just because we're not as familiar with the names. Dr. Crippen, Edith Thompson, these are all people who readers in Christie's day would have recognized instantly, and sometimes we don't. Most of us still do recognize, for example, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, which forms the backstory of Murder on the Orient Express, or perhaps even a case of foster care gone horrifically awry, which forms the central intrigue of her play, The Mousetrap. Which is now the longest running play anywhere ever. It's been running for 70 plus years in London's West End, shows no signs of stopping. So she just had excellent instincts about everything, including the way that weaving these real life scenarios into her fiction was a way to captivate and fascinate her reading public. And it's something that I very much tried to do with The Busybody. It's one of the myriad homages to Christie that I built into my novel. Okay, so it is time to talk about my book and not Agatha Christie. I'm not just going to drone on about Agatha Christie for this entire talk. But you all seem very engaged, and I mean, who doesn't? If you're here, chances are you love Christie, right? So, and there are a lot of connections between Christie and my book, which is something I'll discuss. So just to give you a sense of what The Busybody is about, I mentioned that I started the All About Agatha podcast 7.5 years ago. So that was in September 2016, at which point there was a big event on the near horizon, just a few weeks away. That would be the presidential election of 2016. The Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton face-off, a tumultuous time, regardless of your political affiliation. And if you remember, there was this period after the election where everyone was sort of wondering what Hillary Clinton was up to. And this is when people were taking photos of her on long walks in the woods behind her house. It was such a weird time. And something about that weird time just stuck with me as the perfect setting for a murder mystery, both on a macro level as to what the country was going through and on a micro level as to what this individual was going through. So The Busybody starts with a ghostwriter who specializes in celebrity memoir, getting a call that the recently defeated politician, her name is Dorothy Gibson, would like to work on her personal memoir, finally. It's something she's been meaning to do for a long time. She never really had the bandwidth for it because she was so busy. Now, in the wake of this very public defeat in the election for president of the United States, she has all the time in the world. And the ghostwriter is hired, and this person is the first person narrator of the story. And if you're wondering what this woman's name is, I'm afraid I cannot tell you because she is never named in the story, not once. She's very enigmatic and withholding character, and I was partially inspired here by Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which also features a first-person female narrator who is nameless. So that's who the ghostwriter is. Dorothy Gibson is not simply a stand-in for Hillary Clinton, even though she is partially, I could even say largely, inspired by Hillary Clinton. She has a habit of saying when she's engaged in conversation or listening to someone, which is something that Hillary Clinton does all the time. I learned this by watching lots of YouTube clips of her and listening to Hillary Clinton's podcast, because she too has a podcast. So I gave that verbal tick to Dorothy Gibson, for example. But I was also inspired by a number of other female politicians, including a group from earlier in the 20th century who first broke into politics by way of a phenomenon known as widow's mandate. So this was when a male politician died and his wife, his widow, was called upon to fill out his term until a more suitable replacement could be found. And by suitable, I do mean male, unfortunately, because it was earlier in the 20th century. And one of the most successful cases of widow's mandate was Margaret Chase Smith, because she did not go anywhere. And this is what happened when these women sort of secured office by way of quote unquote widow's mandate. So her husband was a US representative for the state of Maine when he passed away. So she filled his place. And then she went on to become a senator also for the state of Maine for decades. And she had a storied career. She's probably best known nowadays for delivering this fiery denunciation of McCarthyism on the floor of the Senate. It was called the Declaration of Conscience. It was a really big moment. I find her to be a fascinating historical figure. And there's a lot of Margaret Chase Smith in Dorothy Gibson. Dorothy is also a senator from the great state of Maine. and her middle name happens to be Chase. And it's in Maine that the busybody takes place as the ghostwriter travels up to Dorothy's house, which is in the middle of some woods, and they settle in to work on this memoir together. A few days into the process, they make a run to a local liquor store, as one does, for some much needed red wine. And at the store, they run into a woman named Vivian Davis, who lives in the area. Dorothy's never met Vivian before, but strangers come up to Dorothy all the time, especially in the wake of this election. And Vivian is saying how sorry she is that Dorothy lost and how worried she is about what's going to happen when the person who won becomes president, because this is taking place in that interim period between the election and the inauguration. We're in late November, early December here. Dorothy and the ghostwriter kind of brush off this interaction. Vivian's a bit of an annoyance, and they move on with their lives. But a few days later, they discover that Vivian Davis has died, seemingly by her own hand. She is found drowned in her bathtub with a bottle of sleeping pills by her side. And something about this doesn't sit right with Dorothy. So they go to Vivian's memorial, where they have multiple weird interactions with a suspicious cast of characters who are all staying at the house where Vivian passed away, including Vivian's husband, a man named Walter Bogle, and Vivian's sister. And after the memorial, both out of curiosity and in an effort to be helpful, Dorothy takes it upon herself to speed up the toxicology report for Vivian Davis. Because as any aficionado of history will tell you, the way that the tox report comes back in like 2 seconds in a Law and Order episode is totally bogus. It does not work that way in real life. It takes weeks, if not months, to produce autopsies and supporting documentation, such as toxicology reports. But she wields her local influence, and she cruises along the proceedings so that the toxicology report comes back a day after she requests it. And it's at this point that I would like to read an excerpt from the book. But before I do, I have one more pop quiz. Let's see if you can get it. No pressure. Can anyone tell me who Bernard Spilsbury is? Good. Makes it a lot easier for me, and it'll give my excerpt a little more punch. I mentioned how Christie incorporated real life elements into her fiction, including true crime. So in addition to weaving in elements of the 2016 election to my book, I also engaged in a little true crime fandom of my own as to Bernard Spilsbury. You'll see what I mean and who he is in what I'm about to read, which is a conversation that's taking place between Dorothy and her unnamed ghostwriter and Dorothy's assistant, a woman named Layla Mansour, who may or may not bear striking resemblance to Hillary Clinton's longtime personal aide and confidant, Huma Abedin. Probably heard of her. All right, here goes. Layla burst into the library, holding her iPad in both hands, its screen facing outward. Have you seen this? Seen what? Asked Dorothy wearily. Layla handed her the tablet. Just read it. She took it with a sigh, but when she saw what was on the screen, she sat up straight, bringing it closer to her face. What's going on? I asked. The toxicology report's in. It's done already? Layla nodded as if to say, of course. She was used to things happening at warp speed upon request. This was the world she and Dorothy lived in, and they had imposed their exacting standards on the Office of the Medical Examiner for Cumberland County. It's not the full report from what I can tell, but a big enough chunk of it was just leaked to the press. Story broke a few minutes ago. Why? I asked again, more impatiently this time. What does it say? Dorothy looked up. Vivian Davis didn't have a single drug in her body. What? We all stared at one another. I guess you can't drown yourself, right? Asked Layla. Not in a bathtub you can't, replied Dorothy. But it still doesn't make any sense. Layla popped a squat in front of the couch, her curtain of hair nearly reaching the floor. If someone held her down, she'd have bruises all over her body, some sort of mark. Even if she bumped her head and it was just an accident, you'd see the bump. There were no external signs of trauma, right? Right, said Dorothy. So it couldn't have been an accident, but then how the hell did it happen? We fell quiet, taking it over. Bride's in the bath, I shouted, piercing the silence. Layla turned her head sideways, a bird-like, quizzical movement. Excuse me? Bride's in the bath. It was this famous case from the early 20th century. This psychopath, George Joseph Smith, married women all over England. Usually he'd just clear out their savings and disappear, but 3 of them ended up dead in the exact same way. They were all found drowned in a bathtub with no marks on their body, no signs of violence. Dorothy was nodding her head. This is ringing a bell. The reason the case is so famous is that there was this pathologist, Bernard Spilsbury, who figured out how Smith did it. He actually hired female divers and tested his theory by putting them in a bath. When he pulled on their feet really quickly, the water flooding their nose and mouth would cause them to lose consciousness, and they drowned. One of them almost did drown, actually, during the test. It was easier than anyone thought, and there were no signs of violence. Smith was put on trial for the third murder, but the prosecution used the pattern established in the first two as evidence that he must have done the third one as well. It was the first time that was ever done, all on the basis of Spilsbury's experiments. He's sort of a forensics hero for that reason, even though he started buying into his own hype and became kind of awful. I paused for breath. They were both looking at me with admiration, and maybe a little fear. Seems like you're a good person to have around when something like this happens, observed Dorothy. Is it possible to be flattered and insulted at the same time? Apparently so. This doesn't look so good for Walter Vogel then, said Layla. No, I agreed. In Smith's case, only a husband or a maid would have had the access required to pull off a murder like that. And a lot of the women he married didn't have their own maids. Well, I suppose there's an argument to be made that other people may have had access to Vivian while she was taking a bath, said Dorothy, reasoning it out in her lawyerly way. I nodded. Her sister at the very least, but who knows? Modesty quotients have changed a lot since 100 years ago. And she didn't seem like the most modest person in the world, I added, somewhat uncharitably, which is why I followed this up with a question. Does it say anything about the time of death in there? Based on temperature readings taken at the scene, Dorothy was reading from the article, the time of death is estimated to have been anywhere between 9 p.m. last Wednesday night, the 30th of November, and 3 a.m. the next morning, the 1st of December. TMZ just picked it up. Layla was looking at her phone now. This is going to be everywhere in about 2 seconds, and I mean everywhere. The cause of death is not conclusive, Dorothy read on, but the police are currently operating on the assumption of death by foul play. It slipped so easily out of her mouth. The police, death by foul play. And yet with these words, everything changed. We sat there gaping at one another, till Layla's phone began ringing, followed by Dorothy's. And then things did what, in my experience, they seldom do. They began to happen fast. That is the end of that part of the book. So the everything I wrote there about Bernard Spilsbury and the Brides of the Bath was true. That was a true crime case that Christie and her contemporaries loved to reference. They referenced it all the time. And from there, we really launch into an investigation as to who killed Vivian Davis. And it's a mystery that deepens before it unravels, very much in the form of a classic Golden Age mystery with clues that the reader can use to figure out what's happening, just as Dorothy and her ghostwriter sidekick do, or maybe even before Dorothy and her ghostwriter sidekick do. One detail I want to mention before I open it up to some questions. So please start thinking of questions now. Please don't have 0 questions. It's the worst when you're like, time for questions. There's cricket silence. I'll take anything. Okay. It's a low bar. I'm saying I'm sure they'll have great questions. Before we do a little Q&A, I just want to mention that this is the first book in a 3-book series. But rather than have my detective sidekick duo travel from book to book as they would in a more traditional work of detective fiction, what I have done is to take my sidekick character alone, the enigmatic ghostwriter, and to have her travel from book to book and pair up with a new detective in each new setting. So it's sort of a sidekick series in that way. And that's just a little innovation on the genre to keep things fresh. All right, it is now time for questions. So please, feel free to ask me about this book, about the next book in the series, which I've actually already written, or Agatha Christie, or anything mystery related. Please don't be shy. And again, thank you all so much for coming and for listening to me today. It was a pleasure.
I pulled your podcast.
Oh,
And I see what your top ranked Agatha Christie book is.
yes.
Is your also your favorite Agatha Christie?
That is such a good question because it's not. It's that's very perceptive. Yes. So, well, let's say what it is. I feel like we have to.
The top ranked is 5. Well, it's a tie actually.
True, but we did
Points wise. I mean, points
Yes.
wise, they have the same number of points. There's 5 Little Pigs as the top is ranked number 1. Number 2 is And Then There Were None, which got me started on Agatha Christie when I was entering high school. It was my required reading in my freshman year of high school.
It's
And that's what
often
got me
required,
started.
right?
Yep.
Yeah,
So-
and Then There Were None, I think, is a very that's probably what most people would point to as the best Christie. And it definitely, I mean, there's a very good argument to make for that. Actually, at the one of the Agatha Christie festivals, I organized a panel, and we did a panel event at the festival live in front of an audience where we were arguing as to what the best novel is, since obviously this is so subjective. So I got a bunch of other Agatha Christie experts up there, agathologists, as we call ourselves, or at least I do. And we all agreed by a majority on Five Little Pigs, but then the final, and at the end, it was up to the audience to clap the loudest for a title, and it was Five Little Pigs versus And Then There Were None, and then There Were None blew it out of the water. So it really is a fan favorite. So yes, but I agree that I think Five Little Pigs is her probably her best novel, but my favorite novel, the one I have the most affection for, is The Murder at the Vicarage, which I think is ranked 11th or 12th, something like that.
Hold on, that's number 12.
12, there you go.
So now you've started me all over again.
And there's an episode for each and every one of those books.
And the short stories.
And all the short stories, all 160 or so. And the podcast is still going because there's just always something else to talk about with Agatha Christie. So yeah, The Murder at the Vicarage, it's the first Miss Marple novel, and I love Miss Marple, and I just love that book, even though it's not a perfect book. Yeah. Any other questions?
Not Man in the Brown Suit.
What's that?
Not Man in the Brown Suit. Yeah.
I-
Basement.
I do love the Man in the Brown Suit.
It's one reason you're moving your ghostwriter along in this series, but not the Hillary Clinton character, because Hillary Clinton is also writing mysteries. Isn't she writing
Is she?
thrillers now? with
She
James
wrote.
Patterson
She,
and-
no, you
No.
know what? Well, they did a
That's
little.
Clinton.
They did a little his and hers
Oh,
with
okay.
mysteries,
No, Louise
basically.
Penny.
She wrote a mystery with Louise Penny, and he wrote a thriller with James Patterson.
Well, James Patterson will write anything. with
He'll write anything with anyone. Yes, that's true. And I think that hers did better, actually. I have to admit, I did not read it.
Mhm.
But I heard it was very enjoyable. I mean, Louise Penny is great. I have it actually. I didn't want to read it and have that sort of, in any weird way influence me. I kind of just didn't want it to muddy the waters at all. But I'm sure I'll read it at some point. But no, I very much started with the ghostwriter character, and I think with that voice. And I really like the idea of almost getting to have a clean slate. I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, because I love when you can have a series that is connected, where each book though functions as a standalone, and you don't need to have read. That's what Christie did so well. She wrote all of these Poirots, 30, I believe it was 33 Poirots, 12 Miss Marples. It does not matter. You can read them in any which way. And I think that's also part of, like I said, she was smart about everything. And that's something else that she did really well. And so even though I do have a little bit of a serialized intrigue as to who the ghostwriter is, why she is as enigmatic and withholding as she is, and that will track in order from book to book. But I think given how fresh everything else is in the book, you can still read them out of order, and it's not going to matter. That's at least my intention. So
Is she more of a Hastings or a Watson?
it's so I mean I really appreciate how difficult it is, I think, to have there are advantages and disadvantages to having first person narrator who's the sidekick who is narrating, because obviously the sidekick can't be all that perceptive, or else there would be no mystery, right? They'd be like, oh, I see who did it. Or if they observed everything correctly, there would it would be much harder to fool the reader. So you have to have them either make mistakes or be absent, and not make certain connections that are revealed to them at the end. But I didn't want to make her as doofy as Hastings can sometimes be. And Watson I find to be just very sort of removed, much more removed than I ever remember him. I think often we're remembering a lot of the adaptations also of Sherlock Holmes actually that have much more engaging Watsons than the Watson on the page. This is a very sort of engaged presence who's really right there. So she's extremely smart, but she's just not always good at seeing what's right in front of her, which I think is actually a quality that many smart people have. She has a little bit of blinders on, and that's very helpful as your eyes and ears for a mystery. So I hope that it feels authentic to who she is as a person. But I had a lot of fun with that. It's tricky though. It's really tricky.
So you must be keeping track of all the people you're interviewing. Who's winning? Poirot or Marple?
I should, I haven't actually kept
Really?
track of that. I should.
Yeah,
You're right. I need to go back and see.
it's a tough choice.
It's a really, so at the end of every episode where I have a guest on the podcast, I force them, I say, basically gun to head, you cannot not make a choice.
Right.
Who would you choose, Poirot or Marple? Because it's such a, the age-old question for Christie fans. And one of the many reasons why Catherine and I made such a good team is that Catherine was very much team Poirot and I was
Marple.
very much team Marple. I think I get so excited every time someone says Marple. So in my memory, Marple wins, but she might not. I'll bet you it's pretty close.
Yeah,
I'm not
probably.
joking. I'm actually going to go back now and tabulate that. Thank you.
That might
Yeah,
depend
yeah.
on the person. So if somebody is a listener and if they learn by listening, their auditory, they would love Marple because that's what she does everything. She just sits there and looks innocent and is listening and analyzing.
Yes.
Where Poirot is very visual.
Yes.
He's observing, he's watching. So if you're a visual learner, you probably would have an affinity for Poirot.
Yeah. Yeah. And Miss Marple, a lot of her deductions often have to do with insight into human character. And a lot of those novels are very light on physical evidence to the point where she has to trap the murder at the end of the book because there's zero evidence and there's no way that any, the detective who she tells at the end is like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? She's like, oh, good, I'll set a trap and they'll almost murder a third person, but I'll hide in a broom cupboard. Is literally what she does. And Murder is Announced, rank number 5 or top ranked Miss Marple novel. So yeah, they feel very different. Whereas Poirot he often has it lined up, and I love that. Like I love that you're able to get both those types of detectives. It's rare enough to have created a detective as iconic as Poirot, and then she went ahead and created another one. I mean, that's just I'm in awe of her. Always.
Who else do you like to read? What other mystery writers? I've been a big fan of Richard Osman.
I love Richard
Oh my
Osman's
gosh,
books.
so good. And
so
I've been
wonderful.
reading the new Anthony Horowitz books.
Yes, I've had Anthony Horowitz on twice, actually, on the pod. I've tried to get Richard Osman is too big. He's too big for us. He's too busy. But yeah, Anthony Horowitz I love both the series where he is the sidekick.
Yeah, I love that.
It's fantastic. And he made himself the sidekick with his fictional detective. And then he also has his Magpie Murders series, which is, where you get a contemporary mystery and a classic golden age mystery sandwiched into the middle of that one. So it's 2 books for the price of one. And it's, he wrote Magpie Murders. And when I heard there was a sequel, I was like, how could you possibly do this again? And he did it again. And I believe there's a third one.
There is.
Coming out, right?
Yeah.
So no, I love him. Those are my 2 favorite, actually, sort of more puzzly mystery writers who are writing now. And then I love Tana French, who just came out with another book that's sort of a sequel to her last one. I especially love her Dublin Murder Squad series, which I don't think she's going to be doing anymore, but she's great. And some of the other classic authors as well. Josephine Tey couldn't be more different from Agatha Christie, actually. She's much more about characters and much lighter on the puzzle, but she's one of my other favorite classic crimes. She's writing a little bit later than the Golden Age, but she's sort of in there. And Christiana Brand is another of the classic writers who I haven't read much of hers. I've really only read one of her novels, but it was Green for Danger, which I absolutely loved, and I want to read more of her as well. Yeah, I mean, there are so many mysteries out there.
In writing this book, how did Christie's way she constructs a plot affect? I mean, you've read all the books over and over, so I'm assuming it must influence how you construct your writing.
It did. I think that no one was better at constructing these puzzles than Christie. I think she did it better than anyone. And so we really did look at the construction of these puzzles, because when we would review a book, we would break down the way that the puzzle worked and what clues were used to get from the world as it appears to be to the world as it actually is. That was always the trajectory that we followed as we broke down one of her mysteries. And I definitely used that a lot. The challenge was trying to be inspired by Christie as to puzzle construction, but nothing else, because I never wanted to fall into the trap of trying to imitate her voice or anything about her writing, because you need to find your own voice as a writer. And it's never a good idea to imitate. But when it comes to puzzle construction, which is so specific to the mystery genre, it's like a separate tool that you have to put into all of the other tools that writers bring to any other genre. So I felt like it was okay to be inspired by Christie and really to imitate some of the tricks that she was using. And I also wanted to do that so that longtime listeners of the podcast would have a little bit of a leg up actually on solving this mystery, because I use a lot of the tricks that Catherine and I talked about, particularly talked about a lot on the podcast.
Yeah, because you mentioned the her pacing.
Yes.
So
yes.
Yeah, and that
Yeah.
moves it along. Yeah.
It moves. I think she never forgot about the puzzle, so that she had all of the writerly instincts and talents though to add character and to set a scene, usually very economically, and like all writers do when you're telling a story, you're exploring other themes and you're making points and doing all sorts of things on all different levels if it's a richly layered text. And they really are. I mean, people still say, really, Christie, she is, but yes, she is. If you sit down and you read her as an adult and you give her the time, you will get a lot back from them. But even though she's doing all of that, she never took her eye off of the puzzle, which is why it moves. And by the time you get to the solution, you're just like, oh my God, how could I not have seen that? How did she pull the wool over my eyes? And you just don't feel bored. You're almost never. She wasn't perfect. Like I said, they weren't all masterpieces, but you almost never feel bored. And that too, I mean, I try to be inspired by that. Well, you can be the judge as to whether or not that was successful.
Well, if we can't put it down while we're reading it, we're gonna know that.
Exactly.
Crazy romance. You have any plans of incorporating your legal background in any of your upcoming?
I have the ghostwriter series. There's 2 more books in the works, and I would love to write more books in that series as well and see her in lots of different venues. It's funny because I went to law school and I'm technically a retired lawyer, retired in the state of New York. And not having worked as a lawyer, I feel like law school teaches you how to be good at law school, not necessarily how to be a good lawyer. So when it comes to on the ground expertise in any area of the law, I don't think I have much more than anyone else, even for having gone to law school. But I would love, I mean, I think the setting, and I certainly know lots of people are in the setting, I'd love to do something in that area. I've for a while, there's this great book that was written in the 1930s. I'm blanking. It was an American author who wrote a book that took place during jury duty. So it was a jury who was on a murder case. So that's one murder mystery. And then someone is killed in the jury room. So there's sort of 2 murder mysteries at once. And she was having a lot of fun with that setting. I don't want to do exactly that,
right,
but something like that in more of a legal setting, yes. Like I would love to have fun in that setting for sure. Yeah.
Is it easier to write a mystery than you said you wrote a novel earlier that was not a mystery for you at this point?
It was,
or you prefer it, I guess.
For now, I definitely do for now. I mean, like I said, I think you have to, go where your passion is, and I was passionate about that first book I wrote. And I think after that, I was trying to force myself to write something similar to it. And I was all about mystery at that point. And I always have loved mysteries. And I think I just realized this is what I want to write. It's kind of like what I need to write. And the one thing that I think scared me about it is that you do need to outline, like you really, with the structure, you need to know where you're going, or else it could all fall apart. You can waste a lot of time. That's at least how it works for me. Maybe there are some people who can write a puzzle mystery by the seat of their pants, but that is certainly not me. And I was scared that would make the process boring, or it would suck the creative energy out of it. But it was quite the opposite, because first of all, creating the structure is very creatively engaging as well. But then once you do that, it's almost like gives you the freedom to kind of fill in, with all of the writerly flourishes that you can. And even though your outline stays in place, it's not like you are beholden to every single beat. It does change, and there's a sort of organic nature to that process as well. So I was surprised by that though. It was, I kind of had to take a leap of faith to do that. But now that I've done it once and even twice with the second book, I'm a lot more comfortable, I think, with that process than I was before.
What is the second one called?
The second one is called Loose Lips.
Essentials.
Yes, good. That's the word association I want. On the cover, there will be a ship, so that will strengthen that word association. And the book, not surprisingly, takes place entirely on a cruise ship. So there's a little bit of a death on the Nile.
Closed circle.
What's that?
Closed circle.
Yeah, closed circle, exactly. Yes, all about the closed circles. I think murder mysteries on a boat or something super isolated like that are some of my favorites, and it was really fun to write.
Did you have any input in the cover design? Because the cover design is so clever for this book.
Yeah, so I can shout out my publisher with this. So Kensington Books, who's my publisher, there's a fantastic designer that they have in-house. Her name is Chris Noble, and she came up with this. The only direction I gave them, actually, I referenced Anthony Horowitz because I like how on his covers he only has like one object, and it's very arresting, and there's a lot of negative space. So I kind of said that. And then they came back with all this. I mean, they did the silhouette with the pen and, you know, the drop of ink / blood and the typewriter font for my name. So they made it very writerly, since, you know, my narrator is a ghostwriter, and essentially presented it to me as is. I think I asked for my name to be spread out a little bit more than it had been initially. That was the only change that I made. So I really have to credit them with a great book, because I think it is very arresting because of all that negative space. And I feel like a lot of books now have the writing of like the title and the author's name. It's just sort of like all covered in really big splashy fonts. And I just didn't want that. I wanted there to be an illustration that you could really like see. And I think they certainly achieved that. So yeah, I'm glad you like it too. Right.
Your name is awesome. Is that your given name?
So it's my sister is here, by the way, as well. So she knows this, but so she knows me as Daniel because my first name is Daniel, but Kemper is my middle name.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's our mother's maiden name.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So, and I've been going by it now for. It's not like I just did this for the book. I've been going by it but I only started going by my middle name when I was 21 or 22. So there's an odd bifurcation there in terms of people who've known me from childhood versus law school on, actually, including my husband. So actually, like at our wedding, they had to say like Daniel / Kemper, because like I wanted my parents to feel like they could say my actual name, and it was very awkward and weird, but it's totally my fault. But better to have an unusual name, I guess, for on the book cover, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I just want to ask what's going to happen with the podcast since you're at the end of the novels. You're just going to keep going?
Yeah, I finished the novels a bit ago, because when Catherine passed away, we were actually 60 novels deep out of the 66, and I was able to rely on friends we had made, people such as the author Sophie Hannah, who wrote the Barrow continuation novels, and her mother actually did the last book, which was Curtain. The Barrow book, technically not the last book she published, but we thought it was more appropriate to end on Curtain. Actually, Catherine was always the one who thought that, and I would argue with her about it, but she won that argument. And after that, I kind of thought maybe this will wind down, but I still had a bunch of short stories to go, because we also did interspersed with the short stories, so we weren't like reading Agatha Christie novels for our entire lives for 5 years, so we could do other things. And believe it or not, I still have some short stories, like some original Agatha Christie material to cover. And I just, through having met other people and other mystery authors who might have been inspired by Christie, which was like pretty much anyone who was writing in mystery was inspired by Christie, and the fact that, you know, there was this continuation series, the short story collection of Miss Marple stories, for example, that came out last year. Sophie's continuation novel. There's a new biography by Lucy Worsley. the BBC and ITV are putting out new, and BritBox are putting out new adaptations all the time. Kenneth Branagh's adaptations. There's just like there's I heard that. There's just constantly new stuff. So I find that I have the next half year even mapped out, and I'd love to keep on going with it, because why not? We built a great sort of audience of mystery lovers and Christie lovers. So hopefully I can just keep on yapping about Agatha Christie for the rest of my life into a microphone. We'll see how long it lasts.
That's one of my favorite podcasts. Thanks for doing
Yeah.
it.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for listening also, and coming here too to see me. That means a lot. Really means a lot.
If we're going to start rereading Agatha Christie and listening to the podcast, would you
Yes.
recommend reading first, then listening to the episode, or listening to the episode and then reading the book?
Listening, and
Why don't I
First,
because you've read them already, haven't you?
Well, I have, but I'm not gonna remember
Listen and then go
everything.
back. 'cause
Listen
it
and then
really, it
reread.
really brings up a lot.
You said listen, go back, and did you say you said?
I would read first and then listen to the dissection.
Guys,
It depends.
Just an opinion.
I've reread all the Miss Marples over and over, so I know them quite well. So it's good to listen to the ones that I know well, and then I can go back again.
Right. I say if it's been a long time, that you might want to read them and then listen to that episode,
Yeah.
because we really get into the weeds on each book. So if
Yeah,
it
that's
feels,
true.
if it feels
Don't
like,
remember
oh,
who the murderer is.
right,
Okay.
certainly if you don't remember who the murderer is, each book is thoroughly spoiled. Let's put it that way. But yeah, I think probably I would probably err on the side of reading it first before you listen to the episode. But I like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember who the murderer is and you want to like really get into the characters and how the plot's constructed,
Yeah.
you can just
Go right for it.
Yeah,
Yeah, just go dive in. I actually even use the podcast sometimes myself, because if I go on another podcast to talk about a specific book or something, so I have to refamiliarize myself with it, I'll listen to our podcast episode about it, be like, what did we say about it? While I'm rereading it. Actually, sometimes I'll do it. It's like while I'm rereading them.
I've listened to a lot of Agatha Christie podcasts, and just my opinion, yours is by far the best.
Oh, thank you.
How did you meet Catherine? I know you guys were geographically separated, weren't you?
We were both in Los Angeles, but because LA is LA, I live on the west side and she lives further east. So it was like we were living in two different cities.
Okay.
But she went to college actually with my husband. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, they knew each other since they were both like 19 years old. And then she had been working a little in the film industry as well, and they stayed in touch when they both moved out to LA. And I just became friends with her through him. And we used to talk about I remember the first conversation we had, which led to the podcast, was we talked about the Suchet series and the difference in tone between the early seasons versus later seasons, which is like a point I've made like 8 billion times on the podcast now, but how the early seasons are very like larky and light,
Right.
And then it gets very dour and he's like grumpy, lonely Poirot. And she was literally the only other person in my life who completely knew what I was talking about, and I was just like, oh wow, we have the same kind of level of fandom here about Agatha Christie. And then the conversation was kind of led from there. It eventually led to doing this podcast together.
It's nice even today you continue to include her and you continue to play her in your podcast. That's nice.
Yes.
I like to hear that.
Yeah,
like
I
hearing
do
her.
her voice. Yes. And whenever anyone writes in, which people do on a regular basis, saying, I've been listening to old episodes and I just want to let you know, like, I so appreciate what she did, I forward all of those to her mom. And
Oh,
she really appreciates it, and her whole family. So yeah.
What's the Agatha Christie festival like?
It's, I mean, it's in England, so it's far to get there.
Well, not from East Coast.
That's true, actually. I know from LA, it's quite far. I mean, I love it. It's a dream. It's kind of, it's very nerdy. And it is full of both, mystery authors who do some, panels sometimes. So there's a little bit of like, it's a little promotional, which I'm happy that I'm adding myself to that promotion this year with my book. But it's mainly for agathologists. Like it's mainly people like me who have either published reference material about Agatha Christie. Like I reference this guy, John Curran, on the podcast all the time, who wrote Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks. There's Mark Aldrich, who has written these great books about Poirot and Marple and Agatha Christie on screen, and he like kind of lectures about Agatha Christie all over England. It's people like that just giving really deep dive kind of lectures about specific aspects of Agatha Christie's work or Agatha Christie's life. And it's a series of lectures over, at this point, it's, I think, about 4 or 5 days. There's sort of fringe events on either side, and then sort of lighter things like there's a murder mystery mini golf tournament, for example, where it's like you have to find like lost love letter or something like that. So it runs the gamut, or it's like you can have lunch and just talk about mysteries. And there's a lot of socializing also that happens, and people go every year. It becomes an event that they're not. No,
I was gonna ask, they're walking around like murder victims with an axe to the head.
no, it's not like Comic-Con.
Or
It's
Boston, Maine, or whatever.
yeah, it's not like that. There was one guy who dressed up as Poirot, who I've been there 3 times now. I've only ever seen one person dressed up as Poirot. So it's not that. It's a little bit more. I don't want to say academic because that makes it sound dry, but just sort of scholarly in a fun way. It's great. It's really, really great. I highly recommend going. Very interesting.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here.